I think she's staying in. You watch this in
That's because I'm staying.
You save it.
I should have written.
I thought about texting him and saying, hey, you should ride and go out. That's why I did it, because I thought you would.
He showed me a new one. It's beautiful. It's a top.
What's your favorite thing? Right.
It's a
Oh,
fat
it's a
tire.
series. It's a beautiful. We need to don't get your camera.
I just switched.
About to just throw all computers in the trash. I'm gonna throw my notes in the trash, which open the book up. There you go. This is let's see if this has the more.
I told her we were I'm a signature.
No, it's gonna be a box like because this box has.
I told him to expect that. Yeah.
Last night, you said you should go to more and she asked.
But you can't hear. Well, Morgan's got a 1-year-old classroom. And she's hearing screaming. She's got one ear in.
Great. What do I do?
Shoot the one right across. He's right across.
Hey, I'm doing a little matchmaking this morning.
Oh, yes.
And more.
Can you 3-hole punches for me?
Sure.
So you're gonna bite.
I'll get right on that.
Let me borrow your bike.
Hey, how's the
Hey, did you
tire
see
going?
that tire?
I did.
This is a bad tire.
They going okay? Hey, how you doing? Going
Yeah,
well. How you doing?
Great,
good to see you, bud.
You too. A few words.
Yeah.
This is like a rundown.
Do you guys have a copy of the lesson?
Yeah, I don't, not anymore.
I didn't pay a lot of attention when I.
Oh, sorry. I'm right over there.
Oh, you're
Oh, yeah, he's over here.
Okay.
You're
I'm taking up pretty soon.
Thank you.
You can find that out.
Last Friday.
So easy. It's
What day of the week?
We're supposed to broadcast this, but
Yeah.
And I think you did come to work on Friday. And Friday was everyone else's last day in the office.
we're about to get
So
so
as soon as we all left, she left.
if you don't come up with that, then we
The knowledge of
Because we are.
All right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I may have a PowerPoint here in just a minute, but who knows? Thank you very much. Is anybody missing a copy of the lesson material? Okay. So this is just it looks like we might have lesson material and my PowerPoints from today as well. That was unintentional, but that's okay. You just get more information and you know exactly what I'm going to say before I say it. So don't be reading ahead in the PowerPoint because I have animations for them to come up one at a time, so you're very surprised when they show up. So now that I said that, that's the only thing you're going to want to do during the class. Let's see, and let's turn this on just in case the PowerPoint does decide to come up. So this is the class on the Epistle James. So if you're in the wrong class, or you didn't want to be in this class, or you didn't realize I was teaching, I will close my eyes and you can get up and leave right now. It'll be okay, I promise.
All right, they left, Ryan.
Okay, good. All right. I didn't know how long you to do that, but thankfully Clayton's in here and I will always get a word from him. Yeah, it looks like PowerPoint's not gonna
It's coming.
If you need tech help, Sewell can. All right, well that's okay. I'm assuming that everybody is in this class because you've never been in a class on James before, right? Never read the book of James, studied the book of James. That's why everybody's in here, right?
Nope.
I know that's probably not true. I think a lot of people enjoy studying James, partially because it's only 5 chapters. But if you have read it before, if you have studied it before, what do you think is something that is enticing or draws you in to the epistle that James wrote? Go ahead, Chester.
The Proverbs of the New Testament.
Okay, all right. So if you had my PowerPoint, you would see that that's the first thing on the first slide is that we oftentimes do kind of talk about it is as the Proverbs of the New Testament. So why would we mention it as the Proverbs of the New Testament? What does that indicate about the book?
Short, concise conception.
Right. There are these concepts that seem to be kind of loaded, one right after the other. We seem to not just focus in on one specific topic throughout. There's a lot of ideas that are packed into just 5 chapters.
Also a reminder, kind of some parables, particularly toward the end, and so remember the teaching of Jesus.
Okay.
So that brings back to your mind these physical things that have these spiritual applications.
Okay, all right. So we get the teachings of Jesus, in particular that we see that the parables are kind of mentioned in James or utilized in James to give instruction. What else? What else is kind of something that you think about when you think of James or that draws you into studying the book of James? Paul?
Practical Christian living.
Okay, practical Christian living. That's like point number 2 on my PowerPoint. So I'm not thinking that Paula read it. I'm thinking that she just had it. Yeah, practical lessons for living as a Christian. James is full of that. I think whenever we think about Paul's writing, sometimes we think there's a lot of very high-level writing that's going on in his letters, and sometimes I have to see, okay, what is the basic principles that Paul is giving, and I have to figure out how to apply those, which sometimes is maybe a little bit more difficult. James isn't exactly like that. James is much more hitting you in the face with what you need to be doing. And so that's refreshing, except for he is still hitting you in the face. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a few minutes. So if I were to just say, what specific things do you remember are in the book of James without looking and going chapter by chapter?
The tongue?
Say it again?
The tongue.
The tongue, right? Okay. We have taming the tongue. No man can tame the tongue. It's very small, and yet somehow it directs our whole body. With it, we bless God and we curse man. Okay, what else?
Faith without works.
Okay, faith without works is what?
Dead.
Is dead. Okay. All right, what else?
Evaluating yourself in the mirror.
Okay, right. Evaluating yourself in the mirror. You can't just look at yourself and see that you look terrible because you're not taking care of the things that you should be putting in order, and then just walk away and do nothing about it, right?
The true source of temptation.
Okay, right. Chapter 1, we have an understanding of how temptation happens and how it gives birth to sin and death. What else?
How trials benefit us.
Okay, benefits of trials.
Pure religion.
Pure religion, right. What else?
Friendship with the world and friendship with God.
Right, very good. Chapter 4.
And there's also, it talks about there's a war that's going on. I'm assuming the war is within the person.
Okay.
That they want something, they can't have it because they...
Right.
And all that.
Yes. Okay, so there's this kind of fighting with God in the way that we're going through our prayer life or understanding what we need and what we want. This is the only thing I don't know, the double one. No, it's USB and USB-C. So okay. Is there anything else that you specifically think of?
Kind of a theme that flows through rich versus poor.
Okay.
Or money.
Right. Money is definitely something that we see happening throughout, and discussions on the viewpoint that a Christian should have towards money, and maybe specifically the poor view that they have as Christians towards money.
Wisdom.
Okay.
Godly wisdom or fleshly, earthly wisdom. Only two. There are only two wisdoms.
Right.
And so,
Right.
where are we going to
Pick one or the other.
Yeah.
Right. Godly wisdom versus earthly wisdom, or the way that it's termed in chapter 3. Wisdom from above versus earthly wisdom that just has all these bad words that are put with it. Demonic and yes, Ms. Katie. Right. Are you going to do, or are you just going to hear and then walk away and not take any action, right? And thinking about that, and really James as a whole, that idea that because it is, as we mentioned, practical Christian living, it has to make changes in our lives when we read it. We have to, as we said before, look in that mirror and see where we don't look right. And that mirror is the Word of God, which reflects back to us the insufficient portions of our life, the places where we are lacking. And so James is a requirement, or forces the reader to reflect and to change. The faith that's mentioned throughout and the actions that go along with this, James does not allow us to separate. And because of that, you cannot have that viewpoint of, well, I look at the scriptures and I see things and I have kind of this internal mindset, but it doesn't reflect in the way I live my life daily. James doesn't allow that. James has a requirement that when you see it written in the scriptures, that it changes the actions that you take on a day-to-day basis. Now, do you think that's popular today? No. It's not just not popular today in the world, it's not popular today in the religious world. Right? So, Martin Luther in the 16th century wanted to just push James to the side. Because when he looked at James, he said, this is based in old law keeping, the law of Moses law keeping, with that mindset. And that is not compatible with what Paul says in Romans about faith only, about and he's having the wrong viewpoint about what Paul is saying, and he's trying to separate what Paul's saying and what James is saying, when in fact they are, and we'll get to this in a little bit whenever we actually look at the verses was in chapter 2 that's talking about our faith and our works, how they're synonymous. They're not different. There is only a living faith. And the opposite of that, or the other alternative, because as James mentioned, there's two choices. You don't get to sit in the middle of James. James doesn't allow a fence for you to hang out on. You're one side or the other. It's living faith or it's dead faith. And Paul and James are not fighting about that. They're using some different descriptions to deal with problems that are going on amongst new Christians, young Christians. But they are the same thing there. And so it gets pushed aside. If you think about the teaching of Calvinism, the idea that action is required in order for us to be pleasing to God. If we say we have faith, but then we don't act in any way, we don't change our lives, then we don't have a living faith. Our righteousness before God is not righteousness. He even uses Abraham to talk about Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, but he uses the action of sacrificing Isaac to say that is how it was understood that he was righteous. So it goes against Calvinism, which has the teaching that there's nothing that we should be really doing in order to be pleasing to God per se, that God makes us what we are and that's it, and we accept that. And so it is not very well accepted by a lot of the religious community, just because it goes against some of the more common teachings that are going on, and that's not even to say the way that the world would view that there's this book that was written a couple of thousand years ago that actually tells me the way I should live. That's not acceptable either. So James is not very popular in the world as a whole in a couple of different ways. So as you can tell from my PowerPoint here, we're going to go through a few texts. If you do have the material,
the way you just explained it is proper. I think what those men and those who believe in God, what they would say, unfortunately, that those things you're doing, that means you're trying to earn your salvation. Mm-hmm. That's the part where they get wrong.
Right.
And that's so when you tag that on the end of what you just said, then it sounds like, oh, I'm trying to.
Exactly.
And so that's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. This is based on your faith. Your faith results in this. But it's not saying I'm doing this so God can grant me or I can earn something for it, because nobody can do that.
Exactly. James is just saying, I can't separate my faith and my works. I can't do that, right? I think the mentality of somehow the things that I do will equal my salvation. And the only way that salvation is reached is if God gives it to us. But he has an expectation for us to receive that salvation, to keep that salvation. In no way, shape, or form am I ever able to say, well, I did this, and that somehow equals what Christ did on the cross. If I put those on a balance, Christ's blood on the cross is so far superior to anything, I can't even measure the vast difference between the two. But there's still an expectation that God has for me in the way that I act on a day-to-day basis. James is very, very clear in that. And because of that, I do think that there is some pushback against James. And I mentioned earlier that, like Luther in particular, said that he couldn't reconcile Paul and James. James was old law keeping, that kind of mindset, and that it was really just focused on teaching that didn't have a lot of meat, a lot of substance, which I think really it's kind of a way to say I'm not getting these kind of theoretical high points that I can think through and trying to determine, okay, how do I apply this? And then kind of get the opportunity to apply it in the way that I would like to apply it. And so it's being pushed aside. The problem with pushing the book of James aside is something that James mentioned earlier. What teaching is just prolific throughout James? Where's James getting his content from?
Jesus.
From Jesus, exactly. if you have the PowerPoint and you want to look on the second slide where I would have these animations that are coming up really nice, where it says pushing Jesus aside. Are we pushing Jesus aside if we say that James is not really the type of content that should be included with the scriptures or included with the way that I view God? And there are 11 texts that are mentioned in the 5 chapters of James that have a mirror passage in the teaching of Jesus. And not just in the teaching of Jesus. In the Sermon on the Mount alone, we have 11 direct comparisons between what Jesus said and what James said. So the problem with saying I'm not really on board with what James said is saying I'm not really on board with what Jesus said. I have to cast what Jesus said to the side if I'm going to do the same thing with James. And so the joy in the midst of trials, the way that we approach God and ask for gifts, teachings against anger, being hearers and doers of the word, keeping the whole law, and so on and so forth. The Beatitudes themselves cover many of the things that James covers in just 5 short chapters. I heard somebody mention that James quotes Jesus more than any of the epistles, and I don't know how you really, or like kind of gives a direct connection to Jesus' teaching in just 5 chapters. I don't know how that's quantified, but I wouldn't be inclined to not believe that because of how much we see really just direct comparisons to the words that Jesus spoke in James. Oh, you need a copy? Okay, here we go.
You see the Beatitudes are in James, where's that?
The teachings of the Beatitudes are shown in James over and over and over again. Things like blessed are the merciful. James talks about the way that we look at someone else and judge them mercilessly, right? And so that's just one comparison, but we see this same teaching as what Jesus taught in the Beatitudes with what we see in James. So if what's going on in James is that there are maybe two reasons that James is rejected. One is it doesn't allow us to interpret the meaning of those theoretical statements, to make them kind of to our own liking. James is so straightforward. There's really no question with what he is saying. It's very clear. But 2, it puts that requirement on us to live according to a standard, not that we desire, but the standard that God has given, without room for movement one way or another. And so it's and justification does not come, as chapter 2, verse 24 says. Justification does not come except that we are pushing ourselves to live according to that standard, and when we see a fault in the mirror, that we're working to change that. I want to think about, the Pharisees, they were pretty good at kind of saying one thing and then doing something different, right? What are they called by, is it John that calls, I don't think is it John that calls them hypocrites? Or I think, right, Jesus calls them that. Jesus calls them that, right? Who called them brood of vipers? Is that John? John, okay, that's I was getting those mixed up. Not good names, Pharisees weren't exactly, they're not well represented so much throughout the scriptures, but it was because of their hypocrisy, right? In John chapter 8, just read through here. I have written here that James tells the reader that unless he is living according to the law of liberty, as he says in chapter 1, verse 25, that he is deluded. As in a delusion, not deluded like.
Right.
And he is no more a follower of God than chapter 2, verse 19 says, the demons. Even they believe, and they shudder. So if you are just making this claim of Christianity, a claim of a follower of Christ, but then your actions don't indicate that in any way, then you're no better than the demons. Because they also say, yes, we believe in God, and even fear God, and yet they don't take action to change what they're doing in order to follow God. And there's kind of this maybe line of demarcation. There's a clear standard that we're looking at between the two there. In the same way, Jesus, in John chapter 8, when the Pharisees come to him, they say, we are children of Abraham. Right? And Jesus' response to them is, if you are children of Abraham, then he doesn't say have the same faith that Abraham, which I think would still apply. That's what Paul says whenever he talks about Abraham and how you can become a child of God is through his faith. But he doesn't say just faith of Abraham. What does he say? If you are Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. Jesus is not teaching something different than James. Jesus says, if you are children of the faith, then you should be doing what children of the faith do. And then he says, but you're not. You are of your father who? The devil. Why? Because you want to do the deeds of the devil. So James and Jesus both are very clearly pointing to what you do indicates who your father is or who you are of. And so what we see that hypocrisy is a problem that causes this statement of, yes, I believe, yes, I have faith, and yet the actions don't represent the claims that were made. And so James is trying to teach against that. We'll get to who his audience is here in just a few minutes. But another thing I would like to see is that while we see James and we see very frequently kind of a multitude of different topics that are covered, sometimes it might be a little bit difficult to say, okay, so what is kind of a theme or a purpose, or what do we see as the book as a whole? And I think that idea of practical Christian living is a simple one. It makes it easy for us to kind of think of, okay, what are just some things that I know I should be doing? I could go to James, and I can look at different aspects of my life. It's not going to cover everything, but different aspects of my life and say, okay, how am I doing in this area? How am I doing in this area? And even the principles within those are going to expand to larger areas of our life, where we understand the way that we view riches, where we understand the way that we view, we show partiality to others. He talks about based on economic status in chapter 2, but I don't think that it only is in economic status. I think any partiality that we see, and where we're looking at somebody as inferior and somebody as superior just because of some kind of earthly means, is unacceptable to God. So there are there are a lot of different opportunities for us to see ways that we can make changes in our lives. But I'd like to use, kind of in the middle of the book, starting in James chapter 3, is a kind of broad way of looking at the different topics that go throughout James. I mean, we have faith and actions and trials and riches, partiality, our speech, all those things are covered. And I think James 3:13, maybe all the way down through chapter 4, verse 10, might be something good that would give us a way to view them as a group or as a whole, to see how James is kind of attacking each one of these individual things. Verse 13 of James 3 says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but it is earthly, natural, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." Skipping down to verse 4 of chapter 4, "You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy to God." And so, from what I see here, I see that James is giving that statement of, you seem to be trying to sit on the middle of the fence. And God doesn't have an allowance for that. Every single issue that he attacks, he kind of points to two schools of thought, right? Let's just take chapter 1, for instance, where it says, what are we supposed to do with trials? Rejoice. Count it all joy, right? Is that wisdom from above or wisdom from below? From above. What does wisdom from below say?
Trials stink.
Yeah, I hate trials. I don't want to be tested. I don't want to be put to the test. I don't want to be struggling. Right. I should be able to complain when my life is difficult. I should just seek to improve my life whenever there are difficulties that arise. And in particular, if I'm looking at the book of James and seeing that a lot of those trials really seem to be focused on, because I'm a servant of Christ, I'm receiving these trials, then I'm not going to serve Christ anymore. But what kind of wisdom is that? That's earthly wisdom, right? Godly wisdom looks at it from the perspective of, and we'll get into more what it means to count it all joy in the next class, but testing our faith produces endurance. And if I recognize that, I have the recognition of God's wisdom as opposed to the earthly wisdom. I do think that there's also a correlation between that. A lot of the things that are being done, it would seem by these Christians that are spread throughout or spread abroad, dispersed, that they're trying to cling to some earthly things while still maintaining their Christian status. And so, while claiming to be of Christ, I still am trying to get money, right? And I'm trying to ally myself with people that have money, right? I look at them different. I look at them differently as a person that can't really necessarily do anything for me, right? I claim that I have faith, and yes, I'm a Christian, but the actions that I take are really all dictated by earthly wisdom, by the wisdom that is from below and not wisdom that is from above, okay? When I speak, I say really good things to God, but what do I say about my brother? I curse him, right? And so I think I'm not trying to pigeonhole James all into chapter 3, verses 14 through 18 or anything like that. But I do think that it is a good way for us to kind of view that James is showing that there are two schools of thought to everything that we do. You can choose one or the other. You cannot be in the middle. James does not allow that. And so your choices are wisdom that is from above. And where do we get that wisdom from above? God. Like there's His word is the indicator for whether or not what you are thinking and doing is from above or from the earth. Right?
That matter of no middle ground is very characteristic of Jesus.
Right.
But it's the light and darkness and salt and no salt. It's just all the way through.
Exactly. No one comes to the Father except through me. Right? There's no room for
And if anyone will follow me, deny himself.
Right. Exactly. Very good. I'm the more I read James, the more I look at it, the more impressed I am that James knew the teaching of Jesus so well that he was able to apply it directly to just about everything that he says. There isn't any separation between the two whatsoever.
It's like they were brothers.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Maybe we should talk about that. I mean, we are supposed to cover chapter 1, verse 1 today. And Larry and I taught this about 5 years ago, and Larry didn't finish all of chapter 1, verse 1. So I have to get that done.
James and Jesus half brothers.
Yeah, so we're going to cover that here. We'll go ahead and look at that right now. Let me make sure where I am in my PowerPoint. Click. Okay. So once again, that practical Christianity, and just adding another layer to it, I think is that practical Christianity has an understanding that there are two sides, and the only way that we are truly of Christ, and if you call yourself a Christian, you are claiming to be of Christ. That's somehow the word Christian and Christ have kind of been separated over time, where it's just a group that I am part of. Claiming to be of a Christian is claiming to be of Christ. The only way that is true is if we're using the wisdom that is from above. and not the wisdom that is from the earth. Once again, in Matthew 6, verse 24, Jesus talks about that no man can serve two masters. Right? It's the same concept. It's the same thought that's being given by James here. You can either choose to be a friend of the world, or you can choose to be a friend of God. But if you're a friend of the world, you're not just pseudo-friends with God. You are an enemy to God. And so he's drawing a clear separation between the two. Did I see a hand up, or did I hear somebody about to make a comment? Okay, no, too slow. All right, so who is the author? James. Okay, great.
Is that a trick question?
Great, yeah, James. What's James' last name? That would help, right? That would help. If we get these two namers in throughout the text, but we don't have that. I have listened to and read through some digging that other far more intelligent people than I am, and better historians and better students of the Bible, to be honest, have looked through the possibilities. And we have James, the son of Zebedee, right, and brother of John. And so it's probably unlikely that it's him, because why? Why do we know that's probably not him? Yeah, he was killed early, right? Acts chapter 12, somewhere in the early to mid 40 AD. And it's not believed that this was written at that period of time. And most people would put the time of the writing of James somewhere between about 46 and 62 to 65 being the date in which it seems like James, the half-brother of Jesus, was killed. And so, but that's not the only James. There's still more than those two. Are there any other Jameses that come to mind? Right. So the somewhat forgotten other James of the apostles. There are two that are in there. They're given by two names to differentiate between the two of them: James the son of Zebedee and James the son of Alphaeus. So how do we know it's not that James? I'm asking questions I don't necessarily know the answer to, but I just want to make you think about it, right?
Well, there's nothing else really recorded about him other than his name and that he wasn't.
Exactly. Past Acts chapter 1, we don't really see James the son of Alphaeus. And that doesn't mean he wasn't still doing what the apostles were doing. It just seems that we have less of the writing or the kind of public knowledge of who he was. It also kind of stands to reason that the way that he presents himself aligns itself with it being James, the half-brother of Jesus. For instance, Peter and Paul both mention on multiple occasions that they are that they are Peter the apostle or Paul the apostle. Right? That is mentioned. James doesn't call himself that whenever he writes it. Not that that's necessary, but maybe that is also an indication. Also, he just goes by James. And James the son of Zebedee and then James the son of Alphaeus, we kind of have, whenever they're introduced, we get more of the full name so that we can differentiate, okay, which James is this? If this is James, the half-brother of Jesus, he was known. In Acts 15, he speaks up with the apostles being there in Jerusalem and being a pillar of the church there in Jerusalem, as mentioned in Galatians chapter 2, or really just a pillar of the church in general. But
He actually called James the brother of the Lord.
yes, there in Galatians 2, right? James is known, and so he really could just kind of say, James, a servant of God, and I think that would translate to the knowledge of this is the James that we're talking about. Is the half-brother of Jesus. I don't think that's of the utmost importance for the class. Once again, we've already said the teachings of James are in no way, shape, or form falling away from the teachings of Jesus. They're not assuming anything that the teachings of Jesus didn't already assume. He's just pointing them at a group of people that's struggling with this thing, and he's saying, no, you have to see that these were the teachings of Jesus, and you cannot do these things and claim to be of Christ.
However,
Mm-hmm.
he is the James of the second chance. He had an opportunity
Right.
to be a believer when Jesus was alive,
Right?
but he did not believe until Jesus returned and met him.
Exactly. So we could say that James's faith was very clear in his mind because he had that opportunity to maintain the life that he had before, where he didn't have faith in Jesus, that he didn't follow Jesus. But when the evidence was clear to him, and it took him longer than it took others, but when the evidence was clear to him, his heart was 100% fully given to what he's doing there.
I was saying, Paul uses it when Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. This is where the resurrection, the power of it,
Mm-hmm.
that this is one of the reasons why this former non-believing
Right.
brother became a believer.
Right.
Is the proof of the resurrection.
Proof of the resurrection is sufficiently powerful to change any heart that is going to humble itself enough to be changed. James is a great example of that. But what else does he call himself? He doesn't just call himself James, right?
Slaves.
A slave, right? Or bondservant. Okay, so the word is doulos or doulos, or I don't know how to say it. But it's kind of hard for us to translate into English because part of it's just because of the connotation that we put with the word slave and kind of the way that we think of the word servant. And it seems like almost there's like it's in between the two of those. Maybe that's why bondservant is kind of used. But it is the idea that you do not have an option. It's not a sense of employment, I'm receiving this payment because I work here. It is, you're compelled to obey the master. So in that sense, it is being a slave, right? When we think about slavery, it's mentioned as, when he calls himself a slave, we automatically go to reprehensible actions that were done in this country and are done in other countries and have been done in other countries.
Still being done.
Right, where people are stolen, forced into servitude, treated poorly. When we look at slavery to our master, you have to recognize the type of master that's being served. And when James calls himself a slave, he has willingly put himself in the position of slavery. Nobody took him and put him in that. And he is grateful to say yes to the command of the master. And so that is the way that James puts himself out there to those that are teaching. It's also an example to those that he's about to tell, you have to be a slave. You have to be a doulos because you are claiming a master that is giving you commands on how you should act. And so he is not just calling himself that, but he's giving the example of this is what it means to be of Christ, to be a follower of both God and Jesus. He mentions that there in chapter 1, verse 1. A servant or a slave, a doulos, of God and of the Lord Jesus. That word doulos also is the same word that Jesus uses in Matthew 10:24, where he says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. So that gives that, once again, the mentality of a slave has to do what the master says. He is not superior to him. He does not tell the master what to do. And he also doesn't get to say, no, I don't feel like doing that today. Moses tried to do that with God. He kept saying, no, I don't want to. I don't want to. And God's like, no, you're going to be doulos. Get up and go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. It's not acceptable to say, no, I'm not going to take the command of my Lord and to be disobedient to it. And that's one of the things that we see going on through the book of James. Okay, who is it to? Okay, 12 tribes who are scattered abroad, right? Okay, so maybe one of the reasons that it's thought that this is written in the mid to late 40s is a couple of things. One, it will be following the dispersion or diaspora that we see happening in Acts due to the persecution of the Jewish Christians that are in Israel. By who? By the Romans? No, it's by the Jewish teachers, like by the Judaizing teachers that were saying, no, you're teaching Christ. That's contrary to the law of Moses. And in chapter 8, what we're seeing is we're seeing Saul, who later is known as Paul, going and making some pretty big problems for the Jewish Christians. And because of that persecution that's going on within Israel, we see that it gets spread out. But the thing is, whenever it spreads out to all these other nations, where if you're a Jew, was an uncomfortable position to be in. It was not easy to just say, I'm going to leave my home because of this trial, because I have chosen to follow Christ, and I'm going to go live somewhere that I'm not comfortable with, and be around people that maybe do some things that I'm really not comfortable with, and yet still claim to be a Christian, still teach Christianity, and still follow God. That would be a difficult trial to be a part of. So as we see this dispersion that's happening for the Jewish Christians, because their brethren, other Jews, have forced them out of their homeland, we kind of see the introduction to the idea of trials are pretty evident in the lives of these men that he's writing to. And therefore, the things that he's saying probably have a background in the difficulties that they're having because of the trials that came up from them being sent out. Or at least that's maybe a bit of a starting point. So that's all chapter 1, verse 1. I finished. Okay? And so the lesson material here, like I said, I didn't realize the PowerPoints were being put in there as well. But it's the first 3 lessons. The first 3 lessons are here. And yeah, there are questions within the lessons that are really just there to get us thinking before we come into class. So we're going to be ready to talk about some of the words that are in here and some of the concepts that James is talking to us about. Thank you for your participation and your patience.
Good job, Ryan.
Thank you.